Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the Evolution Show. This series charting the evolution of Alfredo Morelos at Rangers. My name is David Edgar. I'm your host as always, and joining me is my good friend and colleague, Four Lads Had a Dream Kingpin, Stephen Clifford. Hello Stevie.
Hello mate, nice to be back for another episode. Looking forward to this one. I think last week we set the scene for Alfredo.
Yeah, we did, and thank you to everyone for the really positive feedback on it. It's always nice to get. We're looking forward to continuing on with that now. As Stephen said, we took it right up to the summer of 2018, when, of course, the whole of Rangers was put on a new and ultimately successful course with the arrival of Steven Gerrard. And we spoke last week. Steven Gerrard had earmarked some players at the start that he felt would be key players for him, and one of those was Alfredo Morelos. And one of the key things about this that we felt at the time was that, of course, Michael Beale is a fluent Spanish speaker. And Stevie, that we felt would be very important because previously Alfredo had really communicated through Daniel Candeias, who was fluent in English and could speak Spanish as well. So this almost sort of removed a barrier and allowed a more direct level of communication to take place.
Yeah, and we were hoping that it would kick him on, and by this point we already knew that he was going to be the front man, the kind of focal man, the main man, if you like, in Gerrard's team. He'd already, obviously we spoke about it last week, that he'd been earmarked very early on as one. And the good thing about this is that from very early on, as we'll speak about as we sort of chart the season ahead, is that I think Alfredo grasped that opportunity, David. I think he took it really well. I think you made a good comment last week, which I really liked, when talking about Jason Cummings and the fact that Alfredo doesn't play very well in a two as the focal point man, with Michael Beale there, hopefully speaking to him in Spanish and all that kind of thing, that he did grasp it and he took it on. And even very early on, it wasn't like we were waiting for Alfredo to kick in. Alfredo seemed to take his game up almost immediately to where it needed to be. It was almost like he'd bedded in the first year and this was him. So like you said, with Beale coming in, we'll never know. I don't think without, sitting down and really telling us Alfredo himself, because he doesn't do press stuff. But if he was, how much it would really help him and things. But I should imagine, just like currently, as we'll get to in many episode time, I think it will help him, and if they can get that sort of repertoire between them. But certainly early on, it looked as if he was benefiting from that. And what I liked very early is we seen an immediate response. And it wasn't as if, or I certainly didn't feel, David, I don't know about you, but I certainly didn't feel as if there was ever a point where, even early doors, where we thought Alfredo couldn't handle this.
No, it's an interesting one, this, because I think that it's a criticism that's been levelled at Alfie. Now, first things first, Alfredo's English is a lot better now than it was then. He can communicate. You've met him, Stephen, and
I think it's a lot better than he wants you to know.
Yes, I would agree with that as well. I think it's a nice thing for him to avoid doing media duties, which he hates. But he can communicate perfectly well with people. You wouldn't necessarily ask him to direct a light opera, but in terms of being able to communicate on a day-to-day basis, there's no problem there. But it did take a while for him to get up to speed there. And it's a criticism that gets levelled a lot, and I feel uncomfortable with. It gets levelled a lot at foreign players when they come to the nation. And I'll tell you why I feel uncomfortable with it. I can't speak a foreign language. I'd love to. I have attempted to learn, and I have failed. It's not easy. I think that it's in educational circles, it's considered a lot easier to learn a language if you're learning as a child before your mind gets fixed into the way we communicate in your own language. And by that, what I mean is, because there are so many different rules, of grammar and words over here that mean 3 or 4 different things, and all of the attendant things, it can be hard to get your head right. And I really admire people who can speak multiple languages. So I'm not sure I buy into this idea that it's automatic once you live in a country that you will begin to speak the language. And again, I do think it's something that we don't take into account with Alfredo, and a lot of players from similar backgrounds to him. They have very little formal education, very little. So the idea that they will just be able to immediately go into a classroom and pick up English fluently within a year, I'm not sure how realistic that is.
No, I would agree with you. And what I think's ironic about it all, and it's maybe more of a kind of British mindset or whatever, is that we go everywhere. I certainly go everywhere, and we expect people just to speak English back to us. So it's really hypocritical somewhat to be expecting Alfredo to come over here and pick it up immediately when we don't, for example, go to Spain and try and learn their lingo for our kind of time there. So, listen, it could be, especially for a young lad as well, we're not talking about, this is something, we bring up again, but we're not talking about a boy that's, well experienced in life and stuff. He came here as a very young lad, and it will take him time. And I've got no doubt maybe as well, and I think this is fair to say, David, perhaps, after the China bid and things like that, maybe Alfredo didn't overly want to commit to learning English because he thought he maybe wasn't going to be here for long. I don't think that's an unfair thing to say, but you never know his mindset. Perhaps he just kind of didn't really, because I know it took, as you said, it took him a while before he's where he is now. So maybe that was part of it. But I don't think on a football pitch you need to be completely down with everybody else's chat, etc. As long as you know exactly what they're saying to, or more or less what they're saying to you, I think it's fine. But there's a few things to consider. It's not something I overly get precious about and worry about. As long as he's putting things in the net, then it doesn't really bother me.
Yeah, I think it's something that probably is in my head because just this week as we record, folks, I saw online criticism of Marcelo Bielsa for being at Leeds and still using an interpreter. And again, Bielsa's English is better than you might assume by that. But he prefers to do that because his ideas are quite complicated and he feels he wouldn't be able to get them across as well. And it is this sort of idea that you should learn it, and you probably, you should. I get that, and people say, well, if I was going to move to another country where I didn't speak the language, I would learn the language. And again, that is true, but I think it is different. Football's such a transient business. You are realistically as a player. Alfie's already played in Finland and Scotland in his young career. A young Colombian, and could have been playing in other places a couple of times, as you mentioned China already. I think it's such a transient business that it's maybe not. If you or I were to go and work in an office, for example, Stephen, then yeah, we probably, well, no problem about it, we'd need to learn the lingo, and we would maybe not make that decision to move in the first place. But it's not such a realistic thing for a young footballer to say that. I'd love to think if I got an offer to do a podcast in Italy tomorrow, I could go and be fluent in the language within a year. I'm not sure I could. And I think, I'm a relatively clever guy, I've been educated to master's level, but I'm not convinced I could do it because I think my brain struggles because it's so conditioned by the English language. Anyway, it's just a wee thing that popped out my head. But as Stevie said, I do think his English is as good as he wants you to, better than he wants you to believe that it is. So this season would be very successful for Alfie. 30 goals, 18 in the league, 4 in Europe and 4 in the 2 cups. A 30-goal season for a striker, Stevie, I think we would always consider a successful one, no?
Yeah, we certainly would. And his numbers and his stats are very good. But it's one that we'll look back on, I think, without even sounding harsh, as we'll cover and get to. Alfie missed football, and he also was very patchy in his form, as we will find and as we kind of cover. He's very much, and again, this is something that came up last week, he's very much a confidence and a purple patch kind of player. So his numbers were great, but I always feel, and I wouldn't bank against Alfie hitting 30 this year either, incidentally, but I always feel with Alfredo is that he's got more in the locker, and this season, I think, again, was another step from last year, but his stats were certainly good, David. It's the other side of the stats that are pretty big in terms of his discipline, which played a huge part in this season and very early on. But as you said, with his goals, his first one of the season being Osijek away, which was a really vital and a really nice goal as well. So that was
him.
Him.
Glancing low header.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, a short corner out to Tav, who instead of taking the corner was out at the corner of the box, and then he changed the angle and bent it away, and Alfredo just stooped to steer it in. Really nice goal, really big goal in terms of, because
Huge,
at that point I wasn't sure if we could get past them Croatian side just having started, etc. But he leads the line very well, scores a really early goal, and that just seemed to spark him and kick him off. That was, the end of July for us, so we were still another kind of 2 weeks away from the season starting. But a vital, I think, we've covered before in saying that it was a good way for Gerrard to start and get going. It was certainly a good way for Alfredo to kick off the season also.
Now, the start of this season could best be described as a mixed bag. There are some very, very good things, important goals, as Stephen says, but it is merged with red cards. And we can debate, and we will just about to debate, the fairness. One of them was rescinded. The first one comes in the first league match away to Aberdeen, where there's an off-the-ball incident. The referee claims to have spotted it and orders Alfredo off very early in the first half. And Rangers actually go on and look as though we're going to get a victory there. But a last-minute goal undoes us. That one was appealed. And Stephen, our professionally trained referee, can you tell us why he was sent off? Should he have been sent off, and should it have been rescinded?
Should he have been sent off? No. Why he got sent off? Yes, I agree with, in terms of what they thought they saw, but it definitely should have been rescinded. The law changed several years ago in terms of intent and excessive force is where you are. It's all to do with petulance levels and stuff like that. And what they wanted to avoid is that most often footballers, there's wee scuffles, David, in terms of, sometimes you get wee pushes.
Coming together.
Yes, exactly that. So sometimes you get wee pushes and wee shoves and everything. And there was no leeway in terms of how you wanted to deal with it. So if two players had kind of had a wee scuffle, etc., they were both going off, and you couldn't even legislate for it being different. What Alfredo done was petulantly and lazily left the leg in, and we'll come to this later in the season because he does it again. But on this one, the assistant told Clancy at the time to put him off, which he then went over, spoke to him and did. It was rescinded because, yes, he did petulantly kind of kick him, but it wasn't excessive force, which meant it should only ever have been a yellow card. Now, this season, so far, there's been a very high-profile case of this, and it was Livingston sending off at Celtic Park when Kyogo got clipped in the head, and subsequently, correctly, they were given a penalty, which they missed, and he was sent off. Now, it was Bobby Madden, and the lad that runs the line, I actually know, and he works with myself. So he said that Bobby actually got marked down for that because it wasn't excessive force, and they're big on that. So back to the Alfredo thing, correct decision in terms of what he thought he saw, in terms of like if he thinks he saw a really kick, but didn't help us at the time because it turned out it wasn't. It should have been only a yellow. It was correctly rescinded. Doesn't help Alfredo. 12 minutes in, he's off the park. But it was a really poor performance that day, David. A number of things went wrong. Rangers got a penalty kick. Josh Windass was about to shoot into an open goal and pull back. He was the person that pulled him back for Aberdeen was only cautioned, which is a straight red card. It was a goal-scoring opportunity. The goalkeeper was out of the equation. So there was a couple of guys on the line, but it's a goal-scoring opportunity. And because it's a pull of the shirt, he should go automatically. So it was a very awkward kind of start for Alfredo, and a difficult start for us in terms of refereeing, certainly for Alfredo, which we'll see coming on. But sadly for Alfredo, that was it. 12 minutes, first opening game of the season, and we're a man down. So not a great start at all.
He would get goal against Maribor, which was a big win for Rangers at that time, and that set us up to go and take on Ufa. Now, this was the first of the times I used the phrase, "that's me done with them." Now, this one went away quite quickly. Was probably over by the end of that night. But during the game, that was the first time I did it. He picks up a booking, and then a couple of minutes later, picks up another one after half an hour. We're a goal up. We're 2-0 up on aggregate. We're in a really good spot. We've got the away goal, for it was a thing at that point. And they need to score 3 to get back into it. Keep the head, keep it tight. Now, it appeared to be for dissent, and I do think this ref was a little bit card happy, as you will get in Europe, Stephen. But especially for somebody who's just been sent off, unfairly or not, a couple of weeks ago, it was wild. And it wasn't the only thing, because in the second half, Flanagan makes a silly challenge. Again, I think a harsh red card, but even so, I could see the justification for it. And it's just decision making, isn't it?
Yeah, I was very frustrated that night in Ufa, because it's such a massive game for us in terms of finances and where we were at the time, because it just seemed like if we had managed to get through that, it was such a milestone under Gerrard. So for him, my memory is that he got booked for a trip or something stupid, and he immediately got a second caution for dissent straight after it. I'm not sure if he threw the ball down or what it was, but he went immediately straight away after it. The referee, I would agree with. Particularly, he was over officious, is how I would put it.
Yeah, he was.
Very, very card happy.
But you do get that in Europe. You get it in Scotland, but you get it particularly in Europe, and you've got to read the referee, I think, early and be aware of it, particularly the situation that you're in. You're 2-0 up. You've got the away goal. They need 3. There's an hour to play. Keep the head.
Yeah, I'm not sure this was the first occasion where I would have said, right, I've had enough of this, but it was certainly one of the first times I said that he's a time bomb, so to speak, because very early on in that season, he was playing right on the edge. I think that's fair. And I think that was a lot to do with the team at the time, because he wasn't the only one. If you remember, straight away, Aberdeen were down to 10, but then the following week, St Mirren, Ross McCrory went off, etc. So we were at that point getting a fair few red cards, and Alfie was, I think we were told to play on the edge and not be pushovers, but I think saying that to Alfredo, perhaps not the the best move. But Ufa was a very low point in terms of it's, Aberdeen was disappointing, but if you take that and if it was an isolated event and you take it and he's learned from it, fine. But only a couple of weeks later in such a massive, vital game to potentially throw the team under the bus again is where, a lot of people's patience would have been kind of wearing thin. Fortunately for Alfredo, somehow we got through 9 men. It was quite a unbelievable achievement, really. So it wasn't fixated on, if that makes sense, David.
No, absolutely.
And he got away with it, I think.
Yeah, I think the ire of the support would have been far, because I remember that night there was a lot of celebrations, and I know that some people at times said, well, it's just qualifying for the Europa League. Not yet. Now the celebrations, I mean, look at this season, because obviously we wanted to get into the Champions League. When we got into the Europa League, people were a bit, well, fine, that's the base, and that's true, and that's understandable attitude. But back then, brand new team put together really 6 weeks before. The money that it opened up to us, it was a huge achievement, and everybody was over the moon with the result. And you're right, the debate then, the edge comes off it because everybody's in a good mood, and we had to prepare for a trip to Parkhead about 36 hours later, so there wasn't the time really to focus in on that. And typical Alfie, he then starts to show why we do love him, because he goes on a fantastic scoring run, 7 games in a row, including a hat-trick at Kilmarnock in the League Cup. And he actually should have had another one that day, should he not, for a ball that was quite clearly over the line.
No, I think you're right about it being Alfredo, and I think that was before. This, again, David, was perfectly... I don't want to deviate away from Alfredo's story, but if you remember, going back to the start of the season when Gerrard actually took over, which I think's why all this stuff about officiating is laughable, but Rangers were on the end of several really dodgy decisions. That one that day, Alfredo was clearly over the line, but he managed to score a really impressive hat-trick I think right foot, left foot header, if I remember rightly. I know that he definitely scored a header, and the last one he put in with his left foot after it was put across the face of goal. So I think that might have been a perfect hat-trick as well for Alfredo. But as you said, this was him in his prime, and from the goals on that run, you look at the one against Hearts, that was the one where Candace wins it and he flicks it kind of, not between his legs, but almost like like when the ball goes past you and you flick your behind leg round and it loops right into the net. That was a really great finish.
That was a stunning finish. It was
right
in front of where I sit at Ibrox as well, because it was down at the Copeland
end. Yeah, we started really quickly that day.
It was a tremendous finish. He just, we were 3 up after about half an hour, I think, and yeah, just an absolutely terrific finish from him, and he was flying and he was enjoying his football. You could see it. He was slim. He was such an important player. But again, and we don't want to focus too much on referees, but the next thing we have to mention, because it's a part of the story, although I think it leads more to criticism of Gerrard than Alfredo. He gets a booking against Kilmarnock, and he then gets selected to play against Ayr United in the next round in the quarter-final, and plays well. Rangers ease to a victory 4-0, absolutely no issues there, good performance, but Alfredo picks up a booking. Now, Rangers' striking options at that time were Kyle Lafferty, who was cup-tied, and Umar Sadiq, who had barely any first-team action since the season had started, and Alfredo gets booked, and that will rule him out, 2 yellow cards out of the semi-final. Now, players, we've seen this before. Gaza, I think, is an example of this. That you look at the amount of yellow cards they get, and you think, my goodness, what a dirty player. And then you realise, well, hang on a minute here. It's a case that referees are now not looking to book him, but assuming that he'll do something that will lead to a booking. It's a slightly different mindset. It's not, I am going to book him. It's more a case of, oh, there's him up to his old tricks again. And it's part of what we discussed last week about reputation. And I think during this period, his reputation, I think it still does to a degree, but I think that back then his reputation was going before him. He was getting booked for things that other players were getting away with, and that I would die on that hill.
Yeah, and I would agree. And if you remember that night, it was also for dissent. It was shooting down at the Broomloan end. There was a decision made, and one of their players were getting treatment. And he then, for some reason, became involved in, I don't know if he was telling him to get up or whatever he was doing, if memory serves me right. It was something like that, but he was then booked for dissent. The referee spoke to him, and he does the very thing that he does all the time. And I don't think he means anything by it, but he kind of just puts his arm up and dismisses him as if, go away, fine. And he strops away. He done that, called back, cautioned straight away. And at that point, we're looking at Alfredo sitting there on 7 yellows and 2 reds, more or less, by the time we get to his next incident. And that's far too high for 3-4 months in the season. But you're right, Alfredo, it's worth saying, and it's worth really pointing out, and I like you just said, I'll steal that phrase, I'll die on this hill. I don't remember Alfredo ever making a dirty challenge, ever, David. And I know he's been petulant. We'll come to it. There's games, particularly Celtic game coming up, that will cover that he's petulant and he's dirty and he has wee fly moments, etc. But this isn't a guy who is an animal who sets out to injure players or puts in poor TSS tackles. He doesn't do that. He's not that type of player. This period that he was going through right now, I think, unfortunately, as soon as he looked at a referee or he looked at an official, as soon as he done his mannerisms or said whatever, he was getting cautioned for it. And the more it happened, I think the more that he perhaps rebelled a wee bit against it. I think the more that the referees punished him were harder. So it was like 2 buffaloes, if you like, going head to head. And I think that's changed somewhat, as we'll cover and we'll get to. But I think he's changed it as well. There was definite improvements and different signs. But at this point, I think it was, two forces button heads, and nobody was going to win.
Yeah, I think that it was if you like, one of these situations that are a spiral, really, which is Alfie does something that he sees someone else do, and he sees the other guy get a talking to and he sees a yellow card waved at him. And then it begins to feel unfair. So he's wound up more. He reacts because of that, and he picks up more bookings, and you're locked in this cycle. And I do have a bit of sympathy for him. Now, unfortunately, the only way you can combat that is to accept that it's unfair, which is a lot easier when you're older. You realise the world isn't fair. But when you're younger, you're just going, well, how am I getting booked and he isn't? And of course, you then complain to the referee about it, and the referee books you. And it can just go on. And I do think, look, there are plenty of times, and we've already done it on this show and we'll continue to do it. There were plenty of times that Alfredo Morelos was in the wrong. And when he was, we'll criticise him for it. But I do also think referees were going out with the idea that at some point they would probably have to book Alfredo Morelos. Or it's him again. He's doing that. And also then, because of the attention that's on it, we spoke about this before, that referees are aware that any incident with Alfredo is going to be analysed to the nth degree. It's going to be multiple replays. It's going to be all over the TV. It's going to be in the papers for days. And the quickest and easiest way to avoid that, or to avoid criticism, is to deal with it straight away by, well, look, I did book him. I did send him off. So what more could I do? And it just created this noise around them. But the goals continued to go. We won't dwell on the semi-final. We all know what happened. Umar Sadiq and his decision to round the keeper dive instead of tapping it into the empty net. So Gerrard was asked if he had any regrets that day, and he said, yeah, I regret playing Alfie in the quarters. And it was his mistake, because certainly he should have been aware of it. As soon as the game was won, should have taken him off. But he was a young manager, and young managers make errors, and that was most certainly one of them. But Alfie continued to show up well, particularly, I think, in the Europa League, where we began to see that rampaging Buffalo that he came alive on European nights. He's not the first person to do that, but his performances, I'm not even talking about goals here so much, Stevie, is just his ability to stand with his back to goal and offer Rangers an out ball. In his time at Rangers, we've had so much European success, relatively. And I don't think that's coincidence. I think it's because you and I grew up in the 90s and we watched Rangers, great Rangers teams, but when we lost the ball, we didn't get it back for a quarter of an hour, Alfie provided an out ball, which allowed the midfield to push up, which allowed the defence to push up, which allowed us to just have that option and not be constantly pressed and harried, which you need, because no side can concentrate, rarely 90 minutes against top quality opposition without offering up chances. And as strange as it may sound, the ability to just knock the ball up to somebody who can get in front of the defender, get the ball with his back to goal, and then either release Kent, who's a great ball carrier, Candace was the same, particularly in Europe, or win a free kick, is enormous. And Alfie has been absolutely terrific at that, I think, at his best in his time at Rangers.
Yeah, absolutely. He would get, if I remember rightly, 2 at home to Vienna, was it?
Yeah.
In the 3-1 win, the first one being the immediate equaliser, which was kind of drilled over the face of goal, and he turns it in, and then the second being Candace chasing it down and kind of back heels it to him, and he makes that run. He was never going to pass it to Andy Halliday, who had made the run next to him as well, but he finished it really well. Excuse me. One thing I wanted to slightly deviate, and I'll go back to David after kind of talking about Europe, is that what was going on media-wise, which is important, but in terms of the European thing, you're absolutely right. And what happened is that this was not only a springboard for the team in Europe, but it was a springboard for Alfredo. I think that run, David, gave him belief in terms of how good he actually could be, because we will see, particularly in the group stages afterwards against the likes of Porto and next season, is that Alfredo realised that he had the capabilities, I think, of really taking his game to higher levels, where he was bossing that stage for us. And, when it came about, stat-wise and everything else, that Alfredo's top of all these leagues for stats and everything else. But I think that this first one, David, gave him the confidence to really start, because once he realised that he could, not bully, but occupy, I think is the best description, I think, for Alfredo. He could occupy these defenders and occupy these centre halves so much that it allowed Rangers to get up the park and win free kicks and things like you said. But that group stage, obviously Villarreal, we done well against them a couple of times, and CSK Moscow and things like that. We done for an outing. It was a good one, and he actually, if memory again serving me right, that game out in Moscow, David, we actually should have won.
Oh, we should have won. We had a defensive calamity that night.
Yeah, but
attacking wise, we were great.
He scored, didn't he? He scored the fourth,
yep,
which was chopped off, and it should have counted.
Absolutely,
he was playing right on the edge, and that's
he was onside.
Yeah, but that was a good thing about him. He was playing. This is what I'm trying to say about occupying defenders. I think that what I'm trying to explain is that not that he didn't believe that he could be that good, but I think once he sampled it, and that season, I think he realised that I can really up my game and turn it on and have success at that level. So in terms of a learning curve, that European game was really big, or that European run, sorry. But one of the things I was wanting to say, David, going back, and this is important coming up, obviously there's a slight bit to cover, but in terms of that run when he scored a lot of goals, I don't know if you remember, one of the goals he scored at St Mirren right at the end was one that we had spoke about before. He wins it in a kind of tighter angle and bullets it across. He then celebrated and he got hit by a barrage of coins. The reporting after it was that it was Alfredo's fault for celebrating in front of St Mirren fans, when in reality he'd done his trademark knee slide, turned to the Rangers fans, but during the knee slide he was getting pelted. He was then pulled up by the referee. He wasn't cautioned at the time, but something that happens in a couple of games reflects exactly how Alfredo was getting treated, and not only by the officials but the newspapers as well. And that the narrative behind Alfredo at that point was that everything that he'd done was his, everything that happened to him was his fault. There was no middle ground. There was no saying, well, look, he could learn, but what I'm trying to say is, we as a support have always kind of said, we think it's unfair. However, Alfredo needs to learn. It's not been a case of victimisation or anything else, but there's everybody else when reporting on Alfredo has been borderline xenophobic and things we spoke about last week. This was still ongoing at this point. Even though Gerrard was speaking up for him, it began to kind of dwindle. But if you remember that St Mirren game and that celebration, it's really pivotal in terms of cautions, because as will come, that St Johnstone game just before Christmas, he gets cautioned for celebrating the winner again for the exact same scenario, but being nowhere near those fans. So things that he was doing, you're totally right in saying he was seeing other people doing but getting nothing, but he was getting picked on all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting, because he has had a lot of, I was going to say stuff thrown at him, but literally stuff thrown at him. And to me, it's been greenlit by the media in this country, where they've told fans it's okay to hate him. You're right to hate him, and it is his fault. And then you can't be surprised when people begin to treat him like he's less than anybody else and that he's not deserving of the same respect and laws. I mean, it's just the most straightforward thing in the world, I think, to say at football. I don't give a toss if a player runs over to you, pulls his shorts down and bears his arse to you in a sort of Braveheart style celebration. You don't throw a coin at him. You just don't. It's just not on. It's not acceptable. You have to trust that authorities deal with the players doing it. But you're absolutely correct in saying that Alfredo was getting it for doing things that other players could do with impunity. And again, we're aware that we're going to compare, but let's compare it to someone like Lee Griffiths, where there was always someone else's fault, and the press would make his case for him. It was always due to somebody else. Can you imagine the furore if Alfie had kicked a lit flare back into a crowd of people? Can you imagine that? Yeah. It would have never been off the front pages, the newspapers. It would have been on TV. There'd be questions in the Scottish Parliament about it. They'd be wanting him deported. It's the difference between well, he's a Scottish guy, and therefore we'll give him a lot more leeway. And you see it all over. But there's no doubt in my mind that Alfredo was being held to a different standard to other players. Again, with the caveat of he should have been sensible enough to realise that he was being held to a different standard. But that's easy for me to say, and I get that, because it's difficult to accept when it's happening to you. When, as you say, you watch player X run over and celebrate in front of the fans, nothing said. You watch he goes and does exactly the same thing and the ref belts over with a yellow card. You're going to feel like you're being victimised, and especially as a young man, it's going to get to you. And I think at times it did. And of course, after a lot of praise for the way he was playing, the variety of his goals, the range of his striking play, there was always ups and downs. That season felt like it. The next one would come in December when Aberdeen visited Ibrox, and Rangers had real problems with Aberdeen that first season under Stevie and Gerrard, where we couldn't break them down. A struggle that we had against many teams who played a low block against us, we did often struggle to get in behind, and Aberdeen would do that. Rangers, with a poor performance, would lose at home to Aberdeen. There would be red cards. Alfredo received one of them, Stephen, and it was becoming a bit of a thing against Aberdeen. Now, the first one got rescinded, but even so, it was a tousy game. And again, I'm not sure Gerrard helped, because he bought into the fact it was a battle, and he would speak about it. And I think that sometimes our players went out a bit too ready for that, and not thinking, yeah, but we're much better than them at football. Let's knock the ball about and beat them.
Yeah, if you remember rightly, the big Aberdeen striker, and the name slips my mind. Cosgrove, that's it. He went off early. So he got he got 2 yellow cards quite quickly into the game. The second one being for a kind of late challenge on Goldson, a kind of high challenge out as Goldson went to clear it. Now, if you actually watch the game back, Alfredo's cautions are ridiculous. The first one, he's kind of battling, and it's a wee kind of shove, at most a free kick. It doesn't merit a caution, but over goes the official, storming over, yellow card, waving it right at him, and it's the reaction of Alfredo is just, he looks, what's the word? He looks dispirited. He looks completely fed up. The second one, caution comes, if you remember, it was a kind of a tussle with Shinnie, and he's kind of trying to block Shinnie off, and he slightly grazes his face. Slightly. It's not even his face. The way he goes down, the reaction's absolutely awful. But what they did was, and I think they commented on it afterwards, that they just tried to wind him up, and he bit to it. But again, this goes back to what I was saying about the things that he was getting cautioned for. It's not like he's 2-footing people. These were like, he's getting booked for fouls that are just absolutely nothing, and others that are getting away with. And he's just, by this point, he's just frustrated, and you can see it. So that's having an effect on him. But again, Rangers would lose that night. Questions get asked again over Alfredo and his discipline and where he is. And obviously, we missed a lot of chances that night as well. Lewis made a couple of really good saves. Lafferty and Ryan Jack came really close, I remember. But it's one of those ones where, a big game, big result at that point, and I think we lost the lead that night, slipped off the top of the table. So all in all, not a good night for Alfredo, but it's easier now to reflect on it. But there was no doubt, if you go back, David, and look at those cautions, they were so weak, so poor, and I think that was the vicious cycle that Alfredo was stuck in. He was getting officiated to a standard that nobody else was. He was getting reported on to a standard that nobody else was, that was encouraging this bad boy image, this kind of image that we need to get him out of our game, when what they should have been looking at was a young lad in Scotland that we'd picked up for, next to £1 million, that had just been capped for Colombia, which he just had been against Venezuela. So it was all there, and we had this young superstar, and instead of bigging him up, which he would have got if he'd played for other clubs because of where he was, the negative impact was beginning to show, I think. And it must have been a lot for him to deal with. We'll talk about it a lot in terms of, his bounce back ability, but Alfredo's got that in spades and he's demonstrated it time and time again. But even here, I think this was a really difficult period for him in terms of trying to get past. And he had to change, which I think he has and we'll cover. But I also think they had to change towards him. So this was a really difficult period. And as I said, anybody listening, go back and look at that night and look at the standard of cautions against Alfredo. I'm not saying he's completely innocent, but what I'm saying is other players aren't getting cautioned for what he did there, and it's extremely weak. And I just think that this is where we are, and the things we've said already, David, I don't want to repeat it, but what I'm trying to get is that it's just backing up what we're trying to say in terms of where Alfredo was at that point.
I'd like to make a point just now for anyone who listens to Stevie on Heart and Hand or reads his blog. Stevie doesn't criticise referees for a laugh. Stevie doesn't get tore into them, and because he's done the job himself and does it regularly, still 2 games a weekend sometimes, 2 games a day sometimes, will understandably say, well, okay, I'll try and look at it from the referee's point of view. And that's why when you say stuff like that, I think it carries more weight than when I say stuff like that as a layman, because I know, I'm a football fan with the blue goggles on. I'll say, that referee, he's had this or that and the other, or he couldn't wait to get the red card out. Whereas you will tend to sit down and go, well, okay, but actually, if you look at it, this is why he's made the decision. This is what he's seen. This is where he's coming from. And I do think it gives bigger insight. So I think that, anyone who's listening to this and thinking, well, that's just Rangers fans who've got it in for referees, I can categorically say in my case it's true. In his case, it really isn't. Stevie will try to give the benefit of the doubt, and he will try to view it from what the referee was doing, and doesn't come at it, well, they're all cheats. You come at it a completely different angle. So therefore, when you're saying stuff like that, I believe that to be a wee bit more valid.
Yeah, I think it was Stephen McLean that night. As I say, I was just asking anybody to go and look at it, and then we're not trying to paint a picture of Alfredo being completely innocent. That's not the case. But what we're trying to say is, at that point in his Rangers career, he was getting the rough end of the stick. And I think that's perfectly fair. I don't think he helped. But looking back on it now, I can see why he must have been so fed up. At that point, to that night, when he gets sent off against Aberdeen, that would be his 3rd red of the season. He gets something like 7 or 8 yellow cards as well, David. He must have been thinking at that point, I've had enough of this. And you can't really blame him. Some of the things that he was getting picked on and picked up for were extremely frustrating, not only for us, but definitely for him. But again, he would sit out and then bounce back quite quickly.
Yeah, I think for Rangers fans who'd been about in the 90s, we could see parallels with Gaza. Now, I'm not saying Alfredo's as good a player as Gaza, don't be silly, and completely different types of players. But it was that thing of, that he gets away with nothing. And in fact, that he's under a microscope constantly on the park. And it did begin to feel like that. And if it felt like that to us as fans, then it's going to feel like that to him as a player. Alfie would save Christmas with 2 goals, including a last-minute winner away to St Johnstone. He got one against Hibs, but unfortunately we couldn't hold out for the win. But then came an enormous victory for Rangers against Celtic. You'll remember the game, folks. December 2018, Ryan Jack got the winner. A terrific performance from Rangers that day. Scott Arfield's drop ball, I think, a significant moment in that it I think for the first time in a long time it said to Celtic, nope, you don't get to come here and dominate us. This is our pitch, and we are the team that set the tone on this occasion. And Alfie was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. He battered the Celtic defence. But I think, again, after we've just had our wee discussion there, I think we need to try and be balanced. Well, you do. I don't, but that's right. We've got both of us on the show. But he could have seen red in this match. I think it's fair to say.
He should have seen red. He should have seen red. Not a straight red, but there was 3. If I remember rightly, he had one with Scott Brown where he kicked Scott Brown clear between the legs. He had one where he grabbed...
Is that a yellow card under the rules? Because I'm pretty sure it says in the IFAB rules that a player should be sent off or booked for kicking the opposition player between the legs. asterisk unless it's Scott Brown. I'm pretty sure it says that.
It certainly does in John Beaton's one, which thankfully for us was the way it was. But you could argue again that was petulant, and I think it was. It wasn't excessive force, but this is where you
can't go around kicking people in the nuts.
No, but I don't think you could argue that the way he done it, if you hadn't seen it, what I'm trying to get at is it's not like he's wellied him.
No, it sounds worse than it is. Yeah, I agree.
He does. Then he grabs Callum McGregor, Ryan Christie, I think it was, in the testicles, because Ryan Christie would do it to him and subsequently get a ban in the game the following year after the 2-1 victory at Parkhead. So then the third one being when he stood on Ralston, which has become a rather funny meme. But I think there was an accumulative performance that day in terms of he probably could have been right on the cusp of being sent off. If we're being fair and if we're looking at it fairly, he probably wouldn't have. He probably should have been sent off. But what was remarkable, David, in a weird way, is that he wasn't even cautioned that day. So he went from, he went from St Johnstone, where he scored the winner, celebrating with a knee slide, to getting cautioned for that, to the absolute opposite end of the scale, where a caution would probably have calmed him down, and he didn't even get cautioned for some of the things. And what was even more remarkable was that they took no further action. So he definitely got away with it that day, but his performance was huge on the day. Really dominated the Celtic defence again. It was very much a European performance from Alfredo. Played a big part in the victory. You'll remember that day as well. He was the one that was holding it down the corner when they did win, and the full-time whistle went, and it clearly meant a lot to him. Also, Alfredo's first victory in that game, so it's a big thing for him, because he had came through the season before, where the 4-0, the 5-0 games, and everything else, where he had been mocked largely. So this is what I like about him as well. Ryan Kent kind of gets into that category and stuff as well, that he clearly doesn't like them, which is a great thing, because we want them all to represent us and feel how we feel, etc., etc. And we know that he does. But he definitely, David, I think it's definitely fair to say that he was right on the borderline that day. And if we're being fair and looking at it from a referee point of view, he definitely should have picked up a couple of cards that day.
Now, I think the theme of this show today, folks, is brilliance mixed with discipline. And that really was the story of his season, and I think that's why thematically we've chosen to go this way. And it was summed up perfectly, beautifully, on a wild night at Pittodrie. Rangers would win the match 4-2. It was a classic. It was an epic game of football. It really was. The two teams who, up to that point, had played, Aberdeen had the upper hand, no doubts about that. But the two teams had played sort of kind of agricultural, defensive. Aberdeen sitting defending, Rangers trying to break them down, failing to, and lapsing into just knocking the ball side to side, and Aberdeen hitting on the break. They weren't classic games of football for the neutral. This was. They just both went swinging at each other. And Alfredo was magnificent. He scored what would be Rangers' goal of the season. I think Ryan Jack won the vote for obvious reasons, but I think that in terms of what was awarded, this one got it, because it was an absolute peach. This is a high level technical finish where, with a lot to do and not much time and space to do it, he picks out the perfect finish and coolly and calmly passes it beyond the goalkeeper into the net at the end of a flowing move. A truly stunning top level finish from a guy that we said last week, maybe not a natural finisher, but there are times when the confidence is up and the goals are flowing. Porto the following year's a wonderful example as well, that you wouldn't know that by looking at him. This was sorry to maybe use a pretentious word, but it was exquisite.
Yeah, actually an all-round really nice team move. The first one, obviously, I think Ryan Kent has a shot which has come out an extinctive finish, but the second one is, and I think, David, this is it's came up actually in a kind of quiz question about Alfredo scoring outside the box, I think this might be one of the only time he's actually done it. Really nice move. Ryan Jack and Ryan Kent combine. He takes a lovely touch and then places it. He just rolls it. It's actually, like you said, an exquisite finish with his left foot. And, you know, Rangers go in 3-1 up at half time and bossing it and looking good. And then we fall into the old pattern.
There's an incident out on the Aberdeen touchline in the second half between him and Scott McKenna, who, again, picked up his fair share of red cards in these matches. But they're tussling for the ball. McKenna goes down. Alfie kind of leaves his foot in, and McKenna kicks up and out at him. The referee runs over, sends Alfie off for the initial foot in, and he sends McKenna off for the kick up. Any complaints?
No. I probably complained about it at the time because it happened right in front of me. I was actually at that game. Very good trip. Always a good trip up there. But when you see it again, he I don't know if he... How do I explain this? It's endangering an opponent, which is... I don't think there's much force in it, which is... You'll say to me, well, what about excessive force? But it's slightly different in terms of...
I was going to ask you, if McKenna doesn't kick up, does he send off Alfie? Because I think the ref just comes up and goes, it was one of them 6 and half a dozen incidents. They both get the same punishment.
I think he probably doesn't, but I think that decides it. Yeah, definitely. I think McKenna's action definitely confirms it. But in terms of Alfredo, I think that because of his studs and where he kind of presses down and stands on him more or less, try to describe it. It's not a stamp. It's not excessive force, but it's endangering an opponent because he stands fully on him intentionally. I think that's why he's given. It's naughty, which is why McKenna then kicks up towards him. But yeah, it's a difficult one because he seemed to relish the obvious duels and stuff like that with players. But we've seen this before, David. Like, instead of, again, we were brought up with Mark Hateley. So when Mark Hateley was in a duel like that, he would run them ragged and boss them, but very, very little did he ever cross the line. Whereas Alfredo, when he gets in a situation like that, certainly at that point, he would take it too far in terms of not only was it a battle to win the game, but it was a battle to beat his opponent as well by any means. So I just think that he was getting slightly too caught up on it.
I think he was getting sucked into it, and I think it's...
that's what I'm trying to get.
To like, I think Aberdeen fooled us a lot that season by making the game a battle and dragging us into it. And clearly, when you're a superior football team, a battle doesn't suit you as much as it suits the opposition, because what they're wanting to do is reduce it to a very base level. And I think Rangers did that not only against them, but against Kilmarnock that season. I think that Rangers allowed themselves to be brought down to the opposition's playing style and suffered as a consequence.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. And I just think as well that the things that we had spoken about in terms of Alfredo feeling like he was getting, dispirited. That's the word I'm looking for. That, he was getting cautions and getting kind of not picked on, but he maybe felt like that himself. And then it became easier for him to not be as concentrated and lose his temper on the pitch. Whereas I don't think if you put Alfredo in the same position, I don't think he would get caught in that as easily as he would then. He was still not as experienced as he is now. So it's another setback, David, where you're getting to the point in that time where you were saying this is becoming a real problem. And I think we were all at that point. Again, Rangers managed to win, so we didn't over-examine it, etc. But I think we were all beginning to feel that he was only one or two more away from being, we need to cut our losses. And unfortunately, the next one is the one for everyone. I think that probably the first time that we all put Alfie firmly on the naughty step.
Yes, it was. The next one would be at Parkhead. Crucial game for Rangers. We dropped off in the title race. And again, early, similar to the first one at the end of the season, Scott Brown goes up and tries to wind him up. Bit of contact. It's naughty, to say the least. Alfredo reacts and is sent off. And this one, there was no excuse. It wasn't rescinded. Stephen Gerrard afterwards says that he's very disappointed in Alfredo. Actually says, we've given him so many chances. Rangers are terrific that day and lose 1-0. Didn't deserve to with 10 men. We were absolutely terrific and should have got something, but didn't. And in the end, it was pretty much the end of the title campaign, really. And I think it would have been over anyway, but that put the tin lid in it. And he doesn't play then until the last game of the season. He's on the bench. Jermaine Defoe comes in and Rangers actually play really well. Scott Arfield on the right side of the attack also plays terrifically, and Rangers put together a very good run. Defoe scoring goals. And I think there's a legit and genuine question mark about his future at this point, Stephen. And I will hold my hands up and say, nah, he's a great player, but there's too much hassle with him. Time to, not cut a loss, it's time to make money on the guy. But firstly, I think that was the attitude, and secondly, we'll talk about this more next week when we discuss the following summer, or sorry, the summer that would follow rather. I think that it was a factor in clubs who were looking at him going, nah. And as we both know, Alfredo inspires such huge loyalty in the fan base, and in much in the same way as that you get people who are half glass, glass half empty, glass half full. For some people, that they, Alfie can never do anything right, and for other people, Alfie can never do anything wrong. I think most people are in the middle, somewhere between those two groups. But at that point, the people who were huge fans of him were saying, a club abroad aren't going to bother with his disciplinary record, or once they look into it, they'll see that was rescinded and that wasn't fair. And it's like, no, they do look at it, and they don't look into it in that much detail. They get the stats and they go, good goal scorer, gets sent off all the time, hothead, lot of straight reds. Nah, we'll go somewhere else. That's how it works. And it definitely devalued him.
Yeah, I think a couple of points in that. First of all, that was the day, David, I felt truly let down by Alfredo. And I think that, we had been in a situation where we had defended him. I would defend Alfredo. And I got in a very public Twitter row with Lee McCulloch over Alfredo because, I don't know if you remember, a few weeks before this moment happened, Kurt Broadfoot had slagged him because of the 5-0 cup game where he got 4, and Broadfoot had ended up slagging Alfredo for his kind of easy. I think he said he easily goes down or whatever it is he had said, and McCulloch had defended Broadfoot or made a comment on it, and I got in a kind of spat with Lee McCulloch saying that, and basically just defending Alfredo no matter what. McCulloch probably wasn't being unfair. I think he was just saying that, he gets sent off too much. But I was very much defending Alfredo, and he can, what I'm trying to say is, at that point, we would always be making excuses for him and saying, well, McKenna kicked him, the yellow cards were poor, etc. But I think that's the first time where I felt well and truly let down by him. And the first time where I would have said, we can't continue this. That defeat that day, he didn't play in the next 4, just suspended twice, and then Rangers left him out of 2 squads, away to Hearts and then at home to Aberdeen. He got minimal game time, Hibs and Celtic victories at home, and then played at Command, as you rightly said, the last day of the season, which I think was more to, I don't know, not put him in the shop window, but more to say to him, you're not completely out of the fold, but you need to learn from this, which I think he did. But I just felt that day at Celtic Park, David, that this is the first time that I truly said it's time for him to go. It's time for us to cut our losses, because he ended the season that day. I know we came back and we equalised, Ryan Kent scored, etc., and then we lost a late goal. But you go to Parkhead and we need all our players, and we need players to be on it. And it's not like it was isolated. This is the thing. It's not like we're saying it's a one-off. this was a continual pattern of him getting sucked in. Brown wound him up, and then of course you get the famous he's getting sent off and Brown's pissing himself laughing, which made it even worse because we all realised then they'd been sucked in and not responded. So is it fair to say it's the first time I was heartbroken? Because that's how it felt. It felt like my favourite player, our favourite guy, the one we all pin our hopes on, had truly let us down. And because he'd been sucked in so much, it was really difficult to deal with. And I think that's the first time I ever said, it wouldn't be the last, but it was first certainly that I said, it's time for him to go. But I also think it taught him a valuable lesson, to miss the next 4, sporadic time, and he did score in the last game of the season. But I think that was a lesson from the management, probably as tough as it could have been, that you need to reflect on how you're behaving, and not only for yourself, but what it's doing to the team.
Yeah, and you mentioned there that 4-goal haul against Kilmarnock, and that was the thing about him, that there's an extraordinary football player in there, and every time he was going on these runs, it would be something. And I think the problem is that, look, we accept that no player can be perfect, and players will blot their copybooks at times, and players will make mistakes, and that is fine. It just, everything seemed to come so quickly, and it seemed to be too regularly. If the amount of incidents we've talked about had happened over a 5-year career, it would still be quite a lot for a player, but understandable. And I don't think we would have had the same, level of but it was every 2 months. And that was the thing. You mentioned the word earlier, time bomb. That was a word I heard so often during this period when people said he's a time bomb, and you never know when he's going to go off. And more importantly, an ex-pro said this to me. He said, look, telling you this right now, if I'm in that other dugout, that other dressing room, all week we've been saying, you can get to him. He said, now that might be, people might not like that, might think that it goes against the spirit of the game. He said, but it happens, trust me. And people will be going, we can get at him, wind him up, because they'll react. And I just felt at that point, that it was the first time I felt the day after, no, I still think he should go. And the reason for it was not just, he keeps doing this. There was also an element of Stevie that he won't be allowed to change in Scotland because of the referees, because of the opposition players. They're going to, he's a target. He's got a big target on him, and it's not going away. It's only going to get worse. And it's to his immense credit, and I think to the credit of someone else who'd come in that January, Jermaine Defoe, and we'll talk about that more next week, that he has managed to do that. That's not to say he still doesn't get, as I say, referees looking at him slightly differently. That's not to say opposition still don't wind him up. It's not to say that maybe at times he hasn't quite been as explosive a player because he's been concentrating on tempering it. But from where he was that day, with all the situation around him, to be able to have seasons like last season, this season, I think he deserves an awful lot of credit for that.
Yeah, he does. He deserves massive, massive credit. Where we are currently in Alfredo's kind of development, when you look back on that season, it had everything for him. Explosive in front of goal, explosive goals. He scored. He was the talisman. He was a focal point. And when he didn't play, Rangers really didn't play. And I think that's really fair to say.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying that
Alfredo
he carried
was
them,
by
but
far Rangers better. If Alfredo didn't score, then our chances of winning a game were massively reduced. There's zero doubt that without, I don't care what anyone says, Alfredo Morelos was Rangers' most important player by a mile. And he was that out ball. He was the special guy who could do something out of nothing. We all knew Kent was young and talented, but the numbers don't lie. Who was the guy that was making the goals, that was scoring the goals, that was winning you the points? The numbers don't lie that season. And I think that there was the feeling that, Defoe had come in, again, didn't really work with the two of them together, as we know. But even so, Alfie, I think, was... Yeah, it's the fear, isn't it? And I think the gamble was, will he mature? Because he was very young, and he did. And that's not to say there'll always be that bit of that flame will be burning. at the heart of his soul, but he has matured, and I think it would be incredibly harsh on anyone to say that he hasn't, because I don't believe that it's the case. Again, not to say that he's flawless, not to say that there won't be things that we discuss as we move forward in this show that he could have done better, or he might look back on and regret, but that's just being a human. What you expect to see and hope to see from anybody in any walk of life is learning. And Alfredo's never had a 5 red card season since, so he did learn, and you've got to give him credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Growth. I think that's the perfect word. I think where we would leave this is that, and as we chart his career going, with Rangers, I think every single season has been a learning post. We had the first season where he kind of netted 17, 18 goals, and he was on the kind of periphery of being the main man. Then he becomes the talisman, but he's went slightly over disciplinary wise, etc., but still carried this Rangers team. The season after, he goes on a magnificent 30 goal burst to Christmas, I think it is, if I'm right, or 20, 25 goals, whatever it was at that point. Then hits the buffers and hits issues. Then we have the championship season. But every single year he's grown. Every single year he's kicked back. Every single year he's progressed. And I even think, David, that as we tell this story, I don't even think we've got the best of Alfredo Morelos yet, which is the exciting thing for me. I look at him now, look at the pictures of him and everything else, and he's had that criticism, and he's had it throughout. And every time he gets it, he comes back, and he comes back strong. He silences his critics, and he's about to do it yet again. But at the point we leave it in this podcast and for this episode is brilliant talisman, carried the club perfectly, but so many issues hanging over him. How is he going to respond? And the truth is, and as we know, he responds very well, and then that it goes up and continues to go up. And I just think that for him and everything that he's went through, nothing but admiration for him, because when you do listen back to this podcast and see all the hurdles that he's overcome, I think it's remarkable that he's produced what he has.
That will do us then for this week on Alfredo's Evolution. We will, of course, be back next week. You can hear more from me over on Heart and Hand, and you can read more from Stevie. You can hear more from him over on Heart and Hand. He has a wonderful show on Heart and Hand every week, which I urge you all to go check out. Drops Saturday mornings. But you can also read more from him at the Four Lads Had a Dream blog. Just type in Four Lads Had a Dream into Google. Stephen, thank you. A pleasure as always to look back on one of our favourite players.
Yeah, undoubtedly, we love Alfie. And I've loved talking about it because it makes you realise where he's kind of came through and the obstacles he's overcome. Not saying that they're not self-inflicted. We're not wanting to paint that picture, but what he's overcome to be where he is now. And as we record, I still think I'm so excited to see what's coming next for him. And I'm so excited as we go through his journey. He's just a wonderful player, and we're lucky to have him, and we should enjoy him while he's here.
I will leave you with the words, believe it or not, folks, of a friend of mine who's a Kilmarnock fan, and he said to me at one point, he says, do you know Alfredo Morelos? He said, as a Kilmarnock fan, I hate his guts, and it's because he scores against us, but he's wildly entertaining, and our game would be far, far worse off if we didn't have him in it. So that, from an unlikely source, I think says everything. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll be back next week. Until then, stay safe. Bye-bye.